In the last chapter of our video series, we looked at harvest strategies with limit reference points and target reference points. Limit reference points are set to ensure stocks aren't overfished, and target reference points are set as a goal for getting the most out of a fishery. But people's concepts of getting the most out of a fishery are different depending on who you talk to. Not that long ago, most people thought that getting the most out of the fishery involved getting the biggest long-term tonnage, otherwise known as the maximum sustainable yield, or MSY. More recently, however, people have started thinking that getting the most out of a fishery involves getting the best long-term economic return, called the maximum economic yield, or MEY. Now, MSY, maximum sustainable yield, is calculated with biological information like growth, mortality and recruitment. But to properly examine the economics of a fishery, then we need to factor in other things like dollar value of the catch and expenses associated with fishing like maintenance, fuel and labour. Including this financial information allows us to calculate what getting the most out of your fishery means in terms of MEY, or maximum economic yield. In this video, we're going to use the Western rock lobster fishery as a case study to explore the use of economic targets in fisheries and explain the potential benefits of having an MEY target compared to an MSY target. Up until the mid-2000s, the biological objective for the Western rock lobster fishery was to maintain the breeding stock at or above the levels of 1980 to ensure sustainability.
Well, our family's been fishing in the Western rock lobster fishery for a long time. We've been fishing, I suppose, for over 40 years as a family group, maybe 50 years even. Before they introduced the quota, in about 2007, it was all going pretty well pear-shaped. We weren't very happy at all. We actually put pots on the market, and they were the first pots that we'd ever sold, because we were very concerned about the state of the industry.
There was an issue with lack of recruitment in the Western rock lobster fishery, and that's just one of those things that happens in fisheries. You get good years and bad years.
So, let's now introduce a graph to help demonstrate how different possible targets may be used in a fishery harvest strategy. The best way to explain this graph is to draw it from scratch. On this line, we have fishing effort, and on this line, we have yield from the fishery in tonnes. So let's look at effort first. In the Western rock lobster fishery, effort is measured in pot lifts, but in other fisheries it might be, for example, number of hooks, number of trawls or hours fished. It's important to understand that we're not talking about individual boats here, we're talking about the whole fishery. Now, the curve of our graph starts here, and it's easy to see that if there's no fishing effort, then there won't be any catch. As fishing effort increases, so does the yield, until the fishery reaches a point where the yields begin to decrease because the surplus stock is being fished down. At very high levels of fishing effort, the stock is fished down to a point where there is no surplus of fish, which means no yield as well. But at this point here, at the top of the curve, is where, in theory, we get MSY, the maximum sustainable yield from the fishery. In practice, this point is quite hard to pin down because of uncertainty and year-to-year variations in stock dynamics. Nevertheless, although simplistic, it is worth remembering this graph because it's fundamental to understanding fisheries harvest strategies. In the Western rock lobster fishery before 2005, MSY was the target reference point that fisheries managers were aiming for. The Western Australian State of the Fisheries report for 2005-2006 noted that the Western rock lobster stock remained close to maximum sustainable yield. But did this strategy have some inherent problems and not get the best out of the fishery?
We were always competing with other fishermen before it went to quota, and that was the whole thing. You had to have a fast boat, you had to buy the newest computer program that might give you a bit of an edge or sounder or whatever. You'd leave early and you'd try to pull your pots and get as many pots pulled and get them back onto fresh ground before maybe some other guys might have come to work. The race to fish was crazy.
In 2007 and prior, there were a lot of regulations that were in place to control the catch, but they weren't really, they weren't direct, there wasn't good consideration of the efficiency of the fishery. So there was a lot of extra effort in the fishery and a lot of rules that were more around designing, trying to force the fisheries to be, or to force the fishers to be fishing inefficiently.
Even though the fishery was operating with catches at about MSY, an unprecedented period of low settlement between 2006 and 2013 forced a complete change in how the Western rock lobster fishery was managed. A huge effort reduction of about 70% was introduced to protect the breeding stock. In 2010, the fishery also changed from an effort-controlled fishery to a quota-controlled fishery. These changes were designed to move the fishery from an MSY target to an MEY target, maximum economic yield. To help explain what the difference is, we'll need to go back to our graph and make some changes. The bottom line of the graph can stay the same and remain as effort, but we need to change the vertical line here from yield in tonnes to yield in dollars. The curved line now represents revenue from the fishery, not catches. So let's go back to the part of the curve that maximises the yield. Now, that sounds like a good place to be for a fishery, where catches are highest. That means economic yield is at its best for the fishery, right? Wrong. When you add in the economics of the cost of fishing, it becomes a little more complicated. So let's now add another line representing the variable costs of fishing. Obviously, the more effort, the greater the cost in fuel, repairs, baits, salaries, etc. And for simplicity, we assume the relationship of costs is a straight line directly proportional to effort. If you draw this line out, the cost of fishing will eventually cross the line of revenue, at which point it starts to cost more to catch the fish than revenue raised from selling it. All points on this graph can be biologically sustainable, but only the area between the curved revenue line and the straight cost line is where there is a net positive economic return from the fishery, where revenues are greater than costs. We want our fisheries to be somewhere in this area. You can see though that there is a large range of effort levels that still deliver positive economic returns. At this end, there is more effort in the fishery, smaller stock sizes and generally lower catches. At this end, stock sizes are higher because effort and catches are lower, but economic yield is not as high as it could otherwise be with more effort. This means the fishery is being underutilised. MEY, or maximum economic yield, is when the sustainable catch or effort level for the fishery as a whole maximises long-term profits, or where the difference between total revenues from the catch and the total costs of fishing is greatest. So, on our graph, the point at which there is the greatest difference between revenue and costs is here. This is MEY. Simply put, it's the level of effort that results in the best economic returns for the whole fishery. Remember, we're not talking about individual boats here, we're talking about the fishery as a whole. Now, the good news for fishers is once a fishery is at MEY, the opportunity for good profits for individual boats is optimised. As you can see, MEY and MSY are at different levels of effort. MEY has lower catch and effort, but is more profitable. In the case of the Western rock lobster, fisheries managers made fundamental changes to the harvest strategy and achieved MEY for the fishery. This also made big differences to the level of profitability achieved for the boats remaining in the fishery. However, it's important to point out that these changes didn't come without a fair bit of pain felt by the fishermen. One of the major changes to the fishery was going to a quota system, where shares of the total catch are traded as pots.
Under a quota system, we couldn't catch what we traditionally caught, so we had to go and buy a heap of pots to get to sort of a level where we were of kilos, what we were traditionally used to catch. And I mean, that was hard at the time, but looking back now, geez, I wish we'd bloody brought a lot more.
So they've been through tough times, there's no question about that. A very large reduction in catch, and that was very difficult for very many people, but I think that would be quite minor compared to the upheavals that would have occurred with the dramatic changes in the fishery that would have occurred otherwise.
But 7 years on, and the fishery has seen wholesale changes. not only to the price fishermen are getting for their catch, but also the profitability of their business.
Oh, the fishery's gone from strength to strength since quota. There's no doubt about it. We've had the carts. We've caught a lot less crays, and so the stocks are regenerating, and the catch rates are just through the roof. We're catching more kilos, like for instance, at this time of year than we've ever seen, we've ever imagined. You know, it's just mind-blowing what we're catching really now. We're going out now. It's February. I'm going out and catching in one day what I used to catch sometimes for the whole month.
In any business, balancing costs with income is the trick to making a profit. In recent years, there's been a growing shift away from fishing for tonnage towards fishing for profit. It may seem strange, but in many fisheries, lower catches results in improved catch rates and therefore higher profits. Governments in each jurisdiction have an obligation to ensure that harvests are biologically and ecologically sustainable. But once this obligation is met, they still have a range of choices on what they want from the fishery economically, and this isn't always maximum economic yield. That's because the most suitable economic targets vary from fishery to fishery. In most Australian fisheries, it's appropriate to target maximum economic yield, as we've seen for the Western Rock Lobster fishery. But if unemployment were a special concern in a certain community, then it would be better to target higher levels of effort and therefore employment. Or if the community relied on the fishery for food, then maximum sustainable yield would be the best target. In summary then, while maximum sustainable yield as a target theoretically allows more catch to be taken, it comes at the price of lower profits and less stability in the stock. Compare this with a maximum economic yield approach, which not only improves the overall economic yield from a fishery, but is more likely to result in a healthy fishery with good catch rates and a more stable stock biomass.